Welcome everyone to the STARS presentation today, February 16th, 2022, from the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe Nations in Montreal, Canada. We are at McGill University, a land which has been the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe Nations, and McGill honors, respects, and acknowledges these nations as the stewards of the lands and waters where we work, where we meet each other, where we talk, where we exchange information. And that will be happening today. STARS are lunch hour presentations for science support staff, but this year, because we are online, we are welcoming staff from the Faculty of Agriculture, the Faculty of Health Sciences, as well as the Faculty of Science. Our speaker today is Frieda Beauregard. Frieda completed all her post-secondary education at McGill, specifically at the McDonald Campus in St. Anne de Bellevue. Her undergraduate degree was in plant sciences. Her Master's of Science was in forestry, where she studied tree ecophysiology. And her PhD was in plant ecology, biogeography. She studied the distribution of Eastern North American plants and the potential impact that climate change might have on these distributions. In 2017, she received the Porsild Conso Award in Systematic and Phytogeography for the best published paper in the field of plant systematics and phytogeography by a Canadian student. Frieda has been the curator of the McGill University Herbarium since 2018. We welcome her today. Her presentation is focusing on a very, very special collection within the McGill University Herbarium.
Okay. Yeah, thanks so much for that lovely presentation of my presentation. As was just mentioned, I'm going to be talking about this very special collection that I've had the privilege of exploring and documenting for the first time. I had a student help me discover a bit more about it last summer. Kayla Dowd has also lent a hand in contextualizing this collection as well. A connection that was possible really because of Zoom, as we were all remote at that time. So indeed, Lady Frances Simpson made this collection of plants quite a long time ago, and they're still quite well preserved and housed in the McGill University Herbarium. So a little bit of background on what is a herbarium, perhaps, is in order. So collections of preserved plants. They're somewhat like a library, so they're arranged usually by taxonomy, maybe by geography. We have both organization schemes in the herbarium here at McGill. Again, the plants are just dried. There's nothing extra done to them to preserve them, except that they're kept in very good conditions to prevent damage, really, more than anything else. So they're either glued or, like the collection I'll present to you today, sewed onto a piece of paper, which is forming a stable backing for them. And then along with the specimen, hopefully would go a bunch of information. So like most natural history collections, that information is kept right along with the specimen. So the two are kind of like part of the same object in a way. So for example, this is a fern that was collected in Montreal in the Papineau Woods by one of our early collectors, Andrew Fernaldo Holmes, back in 1822. So just about 200 years ago, which is pretty amazing. So this is the present day location of Parc La Fontaine, which is not too hard to figure out because there's lots of old documentation of Montreal. It was collected at a time when the city was far less industrialized. You know, a special look into the past is provided by this collection of Holmes's as well. And his collection is nicely presented in that it has all the things one would hope for with a specimen. So all this accompanying information that one would hope for. So what species is it? Where was it growing? When was it sampled? Like what time of year? What year was it sampled in? Maybe a little bit about the location. So sometimes he'll mark swamp or something like that as a habitat information. modern collections, we'd hope for a bit more, maybe a lat long coordinate and the Latin names of the species that were growing next to the plant that we're looking at. But in this case, for an old collection, it's really not bad in terms of the information that was collected along with the plant. And so we can ask different kinds of questions with that information as they're associated with the specimen. So say somebody wants to go back and consider what plants were growing in a region historically, they could check this physical sort of library of plants to say, was that really the appropriate name that was recorded, or was it something else? And that wouldn't be possible if it was just a name, right? If it was only a name on a piece of paper, well, there could be all sorts of reasons that that name might not be correct anymore. Perhaps it was a misidentified specimen, perhaps this group of plants was rearranged in terms of their nomenclature a little bit. So there's all sorts of reasons why having this physical piece of plant associated with the information of where it came from is so valuable for herbaria. And so really that's the goal, is to have this metadata always associated and kept together with the physical specimens. Unfortunately, not all collections provide us with that information. And this collection of Lady Frances Simpson's was really one of those collections. So we moved the herbarium recently, myself with the help of a lot of volunteers and ultimately a professional moving company that did the heavy lifting. But in any case, before that happened, a lot of documentation had to be done on what we had in the collection. And as I went along packing things, I was making a record of what was in the collection. So I opened up a box, which most collections are on standardized sheets of paper that fit in nice cabinets, but some things aren't so standardized. And so we also have some boxes that are kind of a mix of different things, some things that are unmounted and that have never been brought into the collection. So this was one of those things, and I opened this box, and sitting on top, there was this little brown package of paper. And I really didn't know anything about it more than what was written on it. So it said, presented by Lady Simpson. I said to myself, I don't know who that is, but at least maybe if they're kind of nobility type, upper class, perhaps there's a record of who they were. And then it also said, Mr. Barnston Lachine. And so I thought, okay, Mr. Barnston Lachine, that's good. I know who the Barnstons are because they're some important early contributors to the McGill Herbaria. The junior Mr. Barnston was actually the founder and first curator of the herbaria. So I thought, okay, this is pretty good. In terms of background information, it's an early collection. If it was gifted to Mr. Barnston and Lachine and by somebody named Lady Simpson. And then I looked inside and really quite a lot can be gathered from the newspapers that are often accompanying these unmounted specimens. And so, I opened it up and I could see there was some newspapers. So I looked up quite closely at them and I could see that it was a Montreal Gazette, which were not uncommon. Often Montreal Stars, Montreal Gazette were common fodder for being chopped up. Rarely there's book pieces, but usually it's newspapers from this time. And so it was from May of 1844, this Gazette. And I started reading it because, gosh, who can't get distracted when they're confronted with such an old piece of newsprint? And I was noticing that there were many boats for sale. There was some alcohol from Jamaica on offer. There was an article on exchange rates of money in different colonies. And then there was a little note about a hotel, which I was kind of curious about. Hold on, I just have to grab my mouse. Here we go. So it says here, I don't know if you can see, Roscoe's Hotel. And I started reading, of course. It says, the undersigned begs respectfully to announce to his friends and the public that he has leased the above well-known establishment and to solicit a continuance of that support and patronage, which for so many years has been extended to his predecessor, Mr. Roscoe, which I thought was quite fascinating. And so I Googled Roscoe's Hotel, which still exists in Old Montreal, remarkably. And it said on the website of this hotel that one of their famous guests had been Charles Dickens, and he had stayed there just 2 years before this newspaper article had been written. Anyway, so that was my little a side distraction as I started looking through this package. I do try to hold myself back, but sometimes I can't. In any case, so that's some of the background information. So I now knew, okay, it's got to be pretty early 1844 newspaper. It doesn't necessarily mean 1844 collection date, right? Because it could be an old newspaper, could have been somebody later. So, but within the ballpark of early 1800s. And now I had collector's name presumably, and an approximate date. So from there, I Googled Lady Simpson. And not being, coming from a history background, I didn't know who she might have been. But it quickly brought up a short biography from the Biography of Canadians, which is a great site if you're ever curious about anybody. Anyway, so the biography of Lady Frances Ramsay Simpson popped up, which matched very well the dates and the association with the collection to the Barnston family, because she was associated with the Hudson's Bay Company, and so were the Barnstons, George Barnston having been an employee of the company. So I learned that Frances Ramsay Simpson was born in London, England in 1812. I learned later that her father was a sugar broker and partly owned a plantation in British Guiana, because the details of that were recorded by the Center for the Study of the Legacies of British Slavery. And so I was able to use some of the information from that organization to get a bit more information on where they lived in London, since the proceeds of the slave trade were sort of on this site linked back to physical locations in London and other places in Great Britain to show where that money ultimately went. So their properties were listed with nice reference back to modern day maps. In any case, so that was her father. So she was one of 15 children, a very large family. And in 1830, at the age of 18, she married her father's nephew and her first cousin, George Simpson, who was at the time 43 years old. And he was also the governor of Rupert's Land, and therefore the North American, basically boss of all of the operations of the Hudson's Bay Company. And so shortly after her marriage, she moved to Manitoba or what was then called Rupert's Land. So I thought, okay, Canadian connection now, it's, getting better. I know who this person is. And I could see that there were lots of documentation on her and her family and everything Hudson's Bay at the Archives of Manitoba, which has an amazing repository of different things from the Hudson's Bay Company, all of their different written correspondence and ledger books and lots of personal things as well to different family that worked there. So there's quite a wealth of primary source documents around this collection. So a little bit, tiny bit of background here. What was the Hudson's Bay Company? What was Rupert's Land, in case you guys need a little brush up on your history? Who doesn't? So they controlled at the time a huge portion of northern North America. So you had, yes, colonies in Quebec and Ontario, which were Upper and Lower Canada, and other colonies in the Maritimes. British Columbia was somewhat disputed between the US and the British at the time. But there was quite a large area that was not terribly disputed, which was under the thumb of the Hudson's Bay Company. So according to the Authority of Great Britain, the Hudson's Bay Company at the time had control over what was called Rupert's Land, and then also what was called the Northwest Territory, which didn't have obviously the same borders as it does now. And in any case, it had been established back in 1670, and then by 1820, it had grown to encompass all of these lands. They had less land that they were having exclusive trading rights over earlier, but they had been granted in 1820 even more of a monopoly. So they had monopoly over trade and laws and quite a lot that went on in this territory. Of course, there were other peoples living in the land that didn't necessarily agree with that, but according to the authority of the Crown in Great Britain, the Hudson's Bay Company had sort of dominion over this huge swath of what became Canada. So anyway, so that's a little tiny taste of background. And they had one colony where there were some colonists coming and settling, which I'll show you a map of in a moment. So one of the many primary source documents is a diary, or rather more of a journal, that Frances Simpson kept of her trip from London all the way to York Factory. So different routes were possible to get to the settlements that were within Rupert's Land. All of them involved going by boats, mainly large canoes. There was also a port at York Factory that ocean-going ships would use, and it was an important depot for bringing in trade goods and sending back furs. Of course, the furs were their main commodity, but they were also making a profit from, marking up goods that they were selling in trade for those furs. So in any case, George Simpson, her husband, who, like I said, was like sort of the big boss of all of Rupert's Land and everything Hudson's Bay Company in North America, he had all sorts of business to conduct at the different trading posts, or they're often referred to as forts or establishments. So they went by sailboat first to New York City, and then by carriage to Montreal, and then they stopped in Lachine and got together their canoe crew, basically. So they were passengers in large canoes. So this journal is somewhat of an interesting primary source document for somebody like myself who enjoys canoeing, because she describes mostly the canoe route that she's taking and the the different portages, the different sections of lakes and rivers and stuff. So they kept a really very brisk pace. Often they would leave in the middle of the night to take advantage of the flat water. So they were often, traveling on larger lakes where during the day there could be sort of slower going because of waves and wind that they would have had to have, fought against as they were moving along. So they would often leave at like 2 or 4 in the morning, somewhere around then, to get going again. So they really worked their canoe crew very hard. So in any case, the day of her departure, she writes, May 2nd, left Lachine at 4 a.m. in 2 canoes manned by 15 hands each, all strong, active, fine-looking Canadians. Our canoe, a most beautiful craft, airy and elegant beyond description, was 35 feet in length. So this is one of the big canoes, right? She then mentions what sorts of foods they have had, and she goes on to say then that in this order, we started the voyageurs singing and the canoe almost flying through the water. The motion is perfectly easy, and in fine weather, it is the most delightful mode of traveling that can be imagined. Although she did later encounter some bad weather, and when the mosquitoes came out a little bit later in the summer, she definitely had a bit of a hardship with those. And it was really, they really were roughing it. Even though she was a passenger, she was, she had to do the walks of the portages and everything on her own for the most part, except for a few swamps, which she got carried through, where the mud and everything would have been almost waist deep. In any case, they made it all the way through to York Factory by June. So like I said, a really fast-paced trip. Anyway, so that brought her out to Rupert's Land. This journal, though, just covers the portion of her actual trip. Okay, so I think the likely location that this collection came from, also based on my having identified all the plants and looked at where they actually grow, was probably in the Red River settlement. So even though they went as far as York Factory, her ultimate destination was this Red River settlement. This area would later become the province of Manitoba, which when it entered the Union of Canada was much smaller. In any case, so this fellow, Thomas Douglas, who was also known as Lord Selkirk, which is why it's sometimes called Selkirk's concession, he had petitioned the Hudson's Bay Company and the government in Great Britain to have the permission to start a colony for largely impoverished Irish and Scottish immigrants. So there was an agreement made that the Hudson's Bay Company would allow for this settlement to happen on the condition that the settlers provide food and a certain number of employees to the Hudson's Bay Company every year. So it was seen as kind of a strategic move. and also that the Hudson Bay Company get to appoint the governor for this Little Red River settlement. So it was really like the governance of this area was still really much controlled by the Hudson's Bay Company at this time. Of course, there were also important First Nations and Métis populations in this area as well. And as it was mentioned at the introduction, one could go on and on about the history of this time and place. It's really, you know, at the start of many disagreements that still are not settled. This time before Canada was created as a country, when you had these first settlements happening. In any case, she lived here for 3 years. I presume that this is when she was collecting plants. She did have a son while she was living here. Keep in mind, she was only 18 at the start of her trip out here, so she was quite young. She did have a son who died in infancy. He got sick and died the same day, apparently, which was really just, you know, hard for her to take. She was very far from her family. She didn't have many friends. And she was often described as being sick while she was there. And anyway, at a certain point, they decided to leave to go back to London. George Simpson also had a stroke unexpectedly. They'd already been planning on leaving, so they went back by canoe to Lachine and then from there to London after this point in 1833 in the early part of the summer. So I'm guessing that it was during this time that she was collecting her plants. So there are a bunch of things that make this collection quite special. Just its age and its location. So there's not that many preserved plants in existence from that early on. So there was some collections made, for example, by naturalists associated with Franklin's first 2 Arctic expeditions that went through this area a little bit earlier in the century, Sir John Richardson and Thomas Drummond. And then there was the fairly famous David Douglas, who gives his name to the Douglas fir, who was sent by the Royal Horticultural Society to collect plants in the Americas. And he would have collected plants through this region as well on his way to the Pacific and then down through California and to Hawaii ultimately. There are some important later collectors, excuse me. So Eugene Bourgeot was sent again by the Royal Horticultural Society to make extensive collections in North America, and he visited this region around 1857, 1859. And then a little bit later, you had the Geologic Survey of Canada making very much a full survey of the country under the leadership of John McCowan. Where he surveyed everywhere, Maritimes, Pacific coast, everywhere. He went all over Canada to make collections. But again, this is a bit later. And these other collectors, obviously they're all men. You don't have that many early collections from Canada by women. You have Catherine Partrail around this time collecting in the area around Peterborough and Belleville. But really, like, nobody was going, no, there weren't any women collectors that I know of that were in this region this early on, which makes it, an interesting collection, both from the history that I've already mentioned and from just the perspective of it being a collection of plants from that early on as well. So a little bit more about this collection that she made. So there's no date anywhere on anything. So the watermark on the pages that the plants are mounted on says Tedman's 1833, which doesn't necessarily mean that they were collected in 1833, because it just means that they were mounted on a piece of paper that says 1833. So there's always a lot of uncertainty, but in any case, there's no dates, there's no locations either. So it's just whatever I can surmise about her history that has allowed me to say that she probably collected while she was there in the Red River settlement. There are sometimes comments on the habitat of where the species occurred. So she might, write prairie plant or rock plant or something like that. She'll often note on the aesthetic qualities of specimens. She has many notes on the anatomy of the specimens and notes on the scientific names, what she thought it might be, if she changed her mind. She occasionally marks something down about the reproduction of the plant or some other little comment. And then she'll also note whether she was sending seeds or roots back in a box, which I presume was for her mother's garden in London, which was where she was going after she left Red River. So the collection is on mixed mounted sheets. So normally, ideally, you'd have just one specimen represented on a sheet. It makes it much easier to put it in a cupboard somewhere, organized by taxonomy. She just, she was doing this collecting for herself. She really was taking notes, I think, for her own amusement and probably for, like I said, her mother's garden, to know what she was sending back. So in total, there's 52 specimens. I was able to identify fairly confidently the species, about 37 of those. Some of them I could only guess the family or genus with any sort of sense of accuracy. The samples, keep in mind, are quite small. Normally, when you'd be identifying a plant, you'd have more material to look at. You'd be able to perhaps take a little piece of it under the microscope and pull it apart. But given the important historical aspect of this collection, I didn't do any of that. I just looked at the plants, took pictures of the plants, and left it from there. So I didn't do anything to touch or disturb the specimens on the page. I carefully transcribed all of her handwriting, which was quite a challenge in itself. But that led to me, having many more clues of how to identify these things, because she would often comment on the color of things and other things like that. And then I looked up for the species that I could identify where their distributions were, to again try to situate me in where she might have been collecting. And that's where I realized that they probably really must have come from Manitoba, because a lot of them only have native distributions west of Quebec. For 12 of these samples, she sent the root back. She knew that mostly they were perennials and that was a way it could be propagated. And for some, she sent the seed back. For a few, she made comments on the aesthetics. So she commented on the scent of 4 different specimens. She made positive comments about the aesthetic of 12 of these specimens. And then she said for 3 of them that they weren't so, beautiful. So I'll go over now each sheet just, quickly to present what the plants are on these sheets, just to give you an idea of what it was she was interested in. So again, I think mostly she was interested in gardening plants, but sometimes she included some weeds. So hard to say what her motivation was in those cases, perhaps just a little bit of boredom. Like I said, she was quite lonely while she was out there. So this is a sheet that I thought I'd start with. It has 3 different species, 4 different specimens, and she's got a little note in pen that says, "These specimens are much faded by drying so that no correct idea can be formed of their beauty. The blue and scarlets in most cases are completely fled, and no knowledge of their primitive splendor remains in any of them. The whole of these specimens are perennials and grow by the root." She's mostly right, but some of them were annuals. But anyway, for example, on this page, there's, like I said, there's these different species. So whenever I've been able to identify one of these specimens to a species, I've included a photo of a living plant. So you can see I've got number 1 there, and it says low pussy toes Antenaria dimorpha. And then I've transcribed as well what she wrote. So in pen, she wrote a small prairie plant, 2, 3, or 4 inches high, and then a name of another, a Latin name of another plant. And so I was able to look at it and surmise what species it would have been. And that there it is, a little picture for you to look at. Then she has another one here, a polygonum, which is a fairly common weed, native also to the region. A very small bog plant with little pink flowers near polygonum, she says. And I'm pretty sure that this was probably a kind of a stunted member of this species that's often larger. And finally, on the page, she has 2 different specimens of what she wasn't sure if it was an azalea. And then later she changed her mind and said it was a Lonicera, which is the genus for honeysuckle. And indeed, it is a honeysuckle. So it's a kind of vining plant that she has, sort of a shrub that, does a little bit of sprawling. in any case, so that's an example of some of her plants. She often was collecting plants that had very high importance, one could say, for traditional diets and medicine. For example, this Rocky Mountain bee plant, #1 here, which she collected. So she's, tried to identify it. She's got a bunch of notes, but nowhere did she mention anything about its use. It was a staple in a lot of Western Indigenous people's diets. And it was used also later on as an intentionally planted forage plant for honeybees. It's a popular one for pollinators. And again, it's one of these ones that's native from Manitoba to British Columbia, but it's not native to this region. So the seeds of this plant can be eaten, the shoots and the leaves can be eaten. It's an annual species. It was often grown in Three Sisters plantings as another species, so a fourth plant along with corn, maize, and squash. Yes, Cleomia, they're closely related to broccoli, so it's not so surprising that it's quite edible. Well, to the broccoli family, not broccoli specifically. And they're also, they're pretty good in terms of their aesthetics. And so there's other Cleomia that are used as annual bedding plants. Yeah, so one of these plants where she's collected it, but I think probably not knowing, or it would seem not knowing about its uses. Another one on the same sheet, prairie turnip, also a staple food. So it was, this is a plant in the bean family, and it has a thickened root that's very starchy and nutritious. And it grows well in dry conditions. So prairie turnip, again, it's one that's native in the West and not in the East. Yeah. And then we also have another plant on this sheet, Liatris punctata, which she did send a root back of, and she mentions that it's very pretty, which it is. The genus that it comes from has several garden perennials that people like to grow. So Liatris punctata is one of the Western members of this genus. And it's interesting, she's got it correctly ID'd on this sheet, and it was first named in a publication edited by Hooker, who was the curator at the Kew Herbarium and Garden. So it was first named in this publication in 1833 called the Flora Boreali Americana. It's also a medicinal plant. Anyway, so yeah, so a lot of these plants are quite interesting in terms of like both sort of their aesthetics. Like, yes, because she was collecting them, she was bringing them into a garden. Some of them have, different medicinal properties. So far, I've presented you things, by the way, which grow in prairie conditions, so in grassland environments. She did also collect a few things which grow more in wetlands. Still on this sheet, we have 3 more species that are, again, quite noted for how cute their flowers are. So she has Western wallflower, prairie rocket is its other common name, a little scarlet globe mallow, and then a Physiostygia, which are also called, there's one that's more commonly planted in gardens called usually obedient plant. Yeah, so again, quite attractive. She's put down root scent underlined, extremely beautiful. And then a little description and what box she put it in. Yeah, so all of them also have traditional medicinal uses. Yeah, so she's noted them though more from their aesthetic point of view. On this sheet again, we have a couple more plants noted for their flowers. So #2, there is butterfly milkweed, which some of you may be familiar with from gardens, although monarchs don't like to eat this when they're caterpillars. One of the few Asclepia species that they don't feed on. And then one species of potentilla. So potentilla is a really large genus in the rose family. Some of them are cultivated ornamentally, some of them aren't. Some of them are more weedy. Yeah, and butterfly weed, people often include it in native plant gardens. And it is quite an attractive plant, really. Like, it has quite beautiful orange or yellow flowers. Here's another sheet. So this plant number 1, I really scratched my head on. So sometimes she's got a sort of incomplete piece of a plant where, it could be one thing or it could be another thing. And it really depends a lot on how I determined what she wrote on the piece of paper. So I think that she wrote climbing plant 8 feet, which in that case, it only really makes sense that it's this Western white clematis species, which matches more or less the flowers. But maybe she wrote shining plant 3 feet, in which case it could have been a thalictrum. She's written both clematis and thalictrum next to this plant. And in early books, when the thalictrums are described, doesn't describe them in terms of their growth habit. It just describes some of their leaves and flowers. So depending on what book she read, she could have been confused by looking at that group, just by looking at their flowers. And I only have the flower to look at. In any case, like a lot of plants, it has male plants and female plants. So I've included here a picture of its male flowers, which is what we have on the left side there, and then the female flowers on the right side. And if you look closely, you can see that in the female flower, you have bits of the stamen tissue, even though it's a female flower. So those stamens there are non-functional, which is kind of cool, which, you wouldn't necessarily guess at if you didn't know that there could also be male flowers in that same species. So just a little botany aside there. In any case, quite a pretty plant. She says, only the slightest breeze is required, or sorry, the slightest zephyr agitates the delicate blossoms of this plant. Anyway, so quite a cute one. Also native only to the West. And then also on the same sheet, she's got the blue giant hyssop, Agastache, which is quite a commonly planted plant for butterfly and other pollinator gardens. It's really easy to grow. It blooms a lot. It produces a lot of small flowers with a lot of nectar, and it's favored by all different kinds of flying insects that use that as their food. And so, yeah, a good one if you're thinking about native plant gardens. So she's taken this one. She's considered it quite nice. She doesn't mention that she's taken a root of it. On the same page, she's got a little groundsel plant and a purple prairie clover, which is another one that was used as a traditional food. It has apparently quite flavorful roots that people would chew on just as sort of a snack. And then it had kind of a sweet flavor. People would also make tea from it. People also used the giant blue hyssop as well, which is in the mint family, for all different things. Okay, on this sheet, so we're going to go through all the plants, don't worry. So on this sheet, we've got a few more things that are kind of interesting. So we have a species of spiderwort, so Tradescantia bracteata, which can be blue or pink. And usually plants in this genus are blue, most of them. And I'm, looking at the length of the bract that's on the flower there, and that I'm pretty sure the flowers on this were pink. She considered calling it Tradescantia rosea, which doesn't grow in that region at all. It's only in the southeast of North America. So in an area that she had never visited. So I think kind of unlikely that it would have been that other species as well. And the morphology does match this long-bracted spiderwort, and long-bracted spiderwort, like I mentioned, can also be pink rarely. So another little aside. So the Tradescantia are quite popular garden plants. They're native to the Americas. And the genus was given as a name, Tradescantia, for 2 early collectors of exotic plants named John Tradescant. So there's John Tradescant the elder and John Tradescant the younger, father and son. And they introduced a lot of plants into English gardens. And they introduced the Tradescantia virginiana back in 1629, which is quite a while ago. Traditional uses of this plant included making a blue dye from the petals, which would have been used to dye leather for fine designs. There's also another species of Antenaria or pussy toes on this page. Again, they have some medicinal uses as well. And then still on the same page at the bottom, I was able to identify 3 different species. So we have a hairy golden aster, which is a species in the Asteraceae family. Many of the plants were in the Asteraceae family that she collected, which is not surprising because they tend to have what we'd say are showy flowers, like something nice to look at. She also collected a wild bergamot, so Monarda fistulosa, which again, very popular in native plant gardens, definitely made its way into horticulture as a plant. And she did send a piece of root of it back. So obviously she recognized it as being a worthy plant for a garden. There are many different cultivars now, and it's got different little varieties going on with it that you could choose at the garden center, but they're all from this species. It's not the only species of domestic Monarda. There's also Monarda didyma, which is the really bright red one that you might also see in garden centers that has a variety that's alba, which means it's got a white flower. Anyway, very many different wild bergamots make their way into gardens. Yes, she also has on this page a sample of an aquatic plant, which again, there aren't really many aquatic plants in her collection, but this one is the water smartweed, which does have really attractive flowers, and it grows as this one is pictured, just floating with its leaves on the top of the water, and the flower will pop up on a little stem, really quite cute. This one was nice and easy to identify. It also was correctly identified to an old synonym name, Asclepia cornuta. So this is the common milkweed. Also, it does have some poisonous compounds, especially as it gets to be an older plant, but commonly eaten for shoots and the flowers. This is a plant that I've eaten many times. Definitely, I would always boil it, but apparently some people say that's not necessary. But quite a delicate flavored spring vegetable, sort of similar to asparagus. Yeah, so a nice one. Also for pollinators, the flowers very heavily full of nectar. And then on this sheet, we have a few species that could be maybe associated with a bog or a swamp somewhere, perhaps. A couple of them I wasn't really able to identify. Wasn't able to see clearly enough. And I didn't know, for example, like what color the number 3 plant was. So I haven't made a guess at what species that is. But number 4 is cotton grass species, which doesn't have many traditional uses except as little cotton ball type things. And there's also a yellow lady slipper on this page, which does have actually many different medicinal uses. And it's quite a widespread species of lady slipper, so it's found in large portions of North America. Quite variable in different regions. You can find different varieties, but in any case, not too hard to say that that's probably what that was. And then here we are, we've got a few other things. So again, she's thought something was maybe a clematis when it was actually a wild cucumber and an annual, although she did send the seed, so perhaps it grew for her. She has something from the genus Nibalis, which is an Asteraceae species, and then a couple of other Asteraceaes I really wasn't sure of. Wild cucumber does have various different medicinal uses. It is in the cucumber family, although its fruits are not good to eat. It's quite an attractive annual vine. If you were looking for something to grow in your garden, if you had a moist, sunny spot, wow, it grows like crazy and it's beautiful, just like that picture. I'm moving right along. Okay, so on this sheet, we have fireweed, Chemnerion angustifolia. And this is one of the only plant, or this is the only plant that I think has a First Nations name given to it as a common name. And I did look at some sources, but I wasn't able to find any reference to this word, Uthkapahpuk. She did say, wow, it's beautiful, sent in a box, handsome, 3 feet tall. It's interesting that she probably didn't recognize this plant, but it is actually found throughout the Northern Hemisphere. So it grows also, in Poland and Russia and other parts of Europe. But anyway, she notices it and takes a sample and sends a root back. She also took, and it has many uses, fireweed. So you can, again, eat its leaves. You can make a really lovely tea from its leaves. Apparently, if you chew on the stem, it's sweet, but I've never tried. So another one that's used as a vegetable traditionally. On the same sheet, she has a hairy puccoon, which is a Latin name for that genus is Lithospermum, which means rock seeded. And indeed, the very hard seeds of this plant had been used as beads. They're white, the seeds. And again, these are all different prairie species, so you would expect to find these in open areas. Moving right along here, we have on this sheet round-leaved wintergreen, which again was used for its antiseptic properties largely and its flavor. And she's mentioned that it's very pretty. There's a species of Astragalus, which is a really large genus in the bean family. I wasn't able to definitively say which Astragalus it was. There's a few that would sort of match the morphology. But she's just said a vetch of a blue color. And then we have another one, which is kind of a favorite of people having kind of meadow style gardens, which is prairie coneflower. Again, very easy to grow. Different varieties have been produced of this one. It is naturalized in Ontario, but it is only native west of Ontario. And she's commented that it's a pretty plant that's 1 foot tall. But she doesn't say that she's sent a seed or anything back. Okay, quickly now I'll just go through these last couple of sheets. So we've got on this page a bunch of plants again that are quite attractive. So another wetland plant, the tufted yellow loosestrife. We have the beautiful Gentianopsis detonosa, which has very beautiful blue flowers. And then she mentions with GM triflorum that it's a prairie weed of no beauty, but in fact now it's actually a really popular garden plant. People love it for not so much its flowers, but for its seed heads, which she has actually sampled in any case. And then finally, this sheet, she's got a few more things. So she's got a wood lily, which she's called a tiger lily, and she sent the root. She's got a little bit of Artemisia, which was a common plant on the prairies in dry, rocky areas, especially. And she's just sort of made a comment. It's actually a very popular garden plant as well for its gray foliage. And then she's got a few more here at the bottom. And this is the last sheet, by the way, that I'm going to show you. So she's got the great blanket flower here at number 4. And another Asteraceae, so she's wasn't sure about which species, but I'm pretty sure it was Rudbeckia triloba, which is the sort of like brown-eyed Susan type plant that you might have seen growing around Montreal in alleyways. It self-seeds quite a bit, but it is a perennial, and it has really cute, smallish flowers for that style of brown-eyed Susan type plant. And then she actually sent a piece of number 6 back, which was a species of Lysimachia. So where was she sending all these roots? Like I mentioned, I think she was sending them to her mother's garden where she lived in London after she left. In a letter from a friend describing a visit that she had paid to the Simpson household, she said, "They have a beautiful garden into which they took me while mother and daughter enlarged on its loveliness. They presented me with their only China rose and a bunch of lilac, these being all the flowers ready." So I know, like I said, because of the efforts that were made to find out where the proceeds of slavery had gone from British slave owners, where they lived. And so I was curious, was there possibly still a garden there? And indeed, no. After they moved out of that house, their whole property was actually turned into a really large workhouse infirmary. So this would have been a place where less well-off, very poor individuals who would have had mostly disabilities because this was their infirmary, would have been sent to live and to do some kind of menial labor for a long time. And then it became a regular hospital for about 100 years. And now this site is in transformation and becoming rent-controlled housing, which is interesting. So not at all a garden anymore. It's had a long history as largely being a hospital. And there's definitely no plants there. So how did the specimens come to belong to the McGill Herbarium? So who was this Mr. Barnston Lachine? So I think Mr. Barnston at the time might have been given these plants when he was quite young. So James Barnston, like I said, he was the son of George Barnston, but his aunt, his dad's sister, was also the nanny to the Simpson children. So she was living at the Hudson Bay Company houses with the Simpson family at a time when James Barnston, when he was quite young, was sent from Red River to Lachine to get basically a high school education. So he arrived when he was 15, and he would have stayed for a few years before going on to Edinburgh, getting a degree there, and then coming back and, like I said, ultimately becoming the first curator and chair of botany here at McGill. So I believe that she probably maybe got his help even, because he would have been educated presumably a bit by his dad in botany. So with that, I'll wrap up and say thank you and take some questions.